Captain James Morrison had served the royal family for 15 years. He had seen many secrets, heard many whispers, and kept them all locked away in his heart. But nothing had prepared him for what Princess Charlotte would tell him on that cold October morning. James stood at his usual post outside the private library at Kensington Palace. The autumn leaves danced outside the tall windows, creating shadows that moved across the marble floor. He had always loved this quiet corner of the palace. It was peaceful here, away from the bustling main halls where tourists and officials rushed about their daily business. Charlotte, now 12 years old, had grown into a thoughtful young girl. She was no longer the giggling child who used to hide behind her mother's skirts. James had watched her grow up, seen her curiosity about the world around her. She asked questions that sometimes surprised even the adults around her. That morning, Charlotte appeared at the library door looking troubled. Her usually bright eyes seemed clouded with worry. She glanced around nervously before approaching James. "Captain Morrison," she said softly, "may I speak with you?" "Privately?" James looked down at the young princess. In all his years of service, she had never asked to speak with him alone. Usually, their conversations were brief and cheerful. She would ask about his family or tell him about her lessons. This felt different. "Of course, Your Highness," he replied, his training taking over despite his curiosity. "What can I do for you?" Charlotte looked around again, making sure no one else was nearby. The hallway was empty except for them. Even so, she lowered her voice to almost a whisper. "I need to tell someone what I heard yesterday," she began, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "I don't know who else to trust." James felt a chill run down his spine. In his experience, when royals said they needed to trust someone with information, it usually meant trouble was coming. But Charlotte was just a child. What could she possibly know that would require such secrecy? "I'm listening, Your Highness," he said gently, kneeling down to her eye level. Charlotte took a deep breath. "Yesterday, I was in the music room practicing piano. You know the one with the big windows that overlook the garden?" James nodded. He knew the room well. It was on the second floor, with excellent views of the grounds below. "I finished my practice early," Charlotte continued, "but I stayed to look out the window. I saw Grandmother Camilla walking in the rose garden with a man I didn't recognize. They were talking very seriously." James waited patiently. He knew better than to rush a child when they were trying to share something important. Charlotte seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "The windows in the music room were open because it was such a nice day," she said. "I could hear parts of their conversation. At first, I wasn't really paying attention. But then, I heard Grandmother Camilla say something that made me stop and listen." Charlotte paused, biting her lower lip. She looked up at James with eyes that seemed too old for her 12 years. "She was talking about a son," Charlotte whispered. "A son that no one knows about." James felt his breath catch in his throat. He had heard many rumors in his years of service, but this was different. This was coming from an innocent child who had no reason to lie or create drama. "What exactly did you hear, Your Highness?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and steady. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember the exact words. When she opened them again, they were filled with confusion and worry. "Grandmother Camilla said, the boy is 25 now. He deserves to know the truth about his father. Then, the man with her said something about it being dangerous to reveal secrets now. He said something about the press and how it could hurt the family." James felt his world tilting slightly. If what Charlotte was saying was true, it meant that Camilla had a son that the royal family and the public knew nothing about. The implications were staggering. "Did you hear anything else?" he asked quietly. Charlotte nodded slowly. Grandmother Camilla seemed upset. She said, "I've kept this secret for over 20 years. I thought it was the right thing to do, but now I'm not sure." Then, she said something about documents. She said she had documents that could prove everything. The mention of documents made James's stomach clench. In his experience, documents in royal scandals were either the salvation or the destruction of everyone involved. they were rarely neutral. The man told her to be careful, Charlotte continued. He said that revealing the truth now could change everything for the family. He used a name. Thomas. He called the son Thomas. James tried to process what he was hearing. A 25-year-old son named Thomas. Documents that could prove paternity. A secret kept for over 2 decades. The pieces were starting to form a picture that could shake the very foundations of the royal family. Your Highness, James said carefully, why are you telling me this? Why not speak to your parents or your grandmother? Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Because I'm scared, she whispered. I'm scared of what it means. I'm scared that if I tell my parents, it will hurt our family. But, I'm also scared of keeping such a big secret. You always seem so calm and wise. I thought maybe you could help me understand what I should do. James felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. This 12-year-old girl had just shared information that could potentially destroy the reputation of the royal family. She had trusted him with a secret that grown adults would struggle to handle. Did your grandmother or the man see you? He asked. Charlotte shook her head. No, I'm sure they didn't. I was sitting by the piano bench near the window. The curtains were partially closed, so I could see out, but they couldn't see me clearly from below. James stood up slowly, his mind racing. He had to think carefully about what to do next. Charlotte was looking up at him with complete trust, waiting for his guidance. Your Highness, he said gently, this is a very serious matter. But, I want you to know that you did the right thing by telling me. Sometimes keeping secrets can be more harmful than sharing them with the right person. Charlotte seemed relieved to hear this. Some of the tension left her shoulders. First, James continued, I need you to promise me something. You must not speak about this to anyone else until we decide together what the best course of action is. Can you promise me that? Charlotte nodded solemnly. I promise, Captain Morrison. Second, James said, I want you to try to remember if there were any other details about this conversation that might be important. Take your time and think carefully. Sometimes our minds hold on to things we don't realize we heard. Charlotte closed her eyes again, concentrating. After a moment, she opened them with a start. There was something else, she said excitedly. The man mentioned a place. He said something about Thomas living in Cornwall. And, he said that Thomas had been asking questions about his birth certificate lately. Cornwall. That detail made the story even more specific and, therefore, more believable. James knew that many people chose to live in Cornwall for privacy, away from the intense scrutiny of London life. That's very helpful, Your Highness, James said. Now, I need some time to think about this situation and decide what the best approach might be. In the meantime, I want you to continue your normal routine. Can you do that? Charlotte nodded, but James could see the worry still etched on her young face. Captain Morrison, she said quietly, do you think this Thomas person is really grandmother Camilla's son? And, if he is, who is his father? The question hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. James knew that Charlotte was intelligent enough to understand the implications, but he also knew she was still a child who deserved to have her innocence protected as much as possible. I don't know yet, Your Highness, he said honestly. But, whatever the truth is, we'll handle it together. The most important thing right now is that you're safe and that we make sure any decisions we make are in the best interest of your family. Charlotte seemed satisfied with this answer. She straightened her shoulders in a gesture that reminded James of her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth. Thank you for listening to me, Captain Morrison, she said formally. I feel better having told someone. I'm honored that you trusted me, Your Highness, James replied. Now, wasn't there a literature lesson you were supposed to attend this morning? Charlotte's eyes widened as she remembered her schedule. Oh yes. Thank you for reminding me. I must go. She hurried off down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. James watched her go, marveling at how quickly she could switch from carrying the weight of a potentially explosive royal secret to worrying about being late for her lessons. But, as soon as Charlotte disappeared around the corner, the full impact of what she had told him hit James like a physical blow. He leaned back against the wall, feeling suddenly dizzy. If Charlotte had heard correctly, Camilla had a 25-year-old son named Thomas living in Cornwall. A son whose existence had been kept secret for over 2 decades. A son who was now asking questions about his birth certificate and might be on the verge of discovering the truth about his parentage. James tried to calculate the timeline in his head. 25 years ago would have been 1998. Camilla would have been in her 50s then, married to Andrew Parker Bowles, though their marriage was falling apart. Charles and Diana were divorced, and Charles and Camilla's relationship was becoming more public. But, if Camilla had given birth to a son in 1998, whose child was it? The timing would suggest that Charles could be the father, but James knew better than to jump to conclusions based on timing alone. The mention of documents troubled him the most. In his experience, when royals talked about documents that could prove everything, it usually meant there were official records somewhere. Birth certificates, DNA tests, maybe even correspondence that acknowledged paternity. James realized he was standing in the hallway, lost in thought, when he should be at his post. He straightened up and tried to focus on his duties, but his mind kept returning to Charlotte's words. The young princess had trusted him with information that could change the course of royal history. The question now was what he should do with that trust. His loyalty was to the royal family as a whole, but different members of that family might have very different ideas about how this situation should be handled. Should he tell Prince William and Catherine immediately? Should he approach Camilla directly and let her know that her private conversation had been overheard? Should he try to investigate the situation quietly before involving anyone else? Each option carried enormous risks. If he told William and Catherine, they would be forced to confront Camilla, potentially causing a family crisis. If he approached Camilla directly, he might be accused of spying on the family he was sworn to protect. If he investigated on his own and was discovered, he could lose his position and his reputation. But, perhaps most importantly, James realized that somewhere in Cornwall, there was a 25-year-old man named Thomas who might be about to discover that he was connected to the royal family in a way that could change his life forever. As James resumed his post, he made a mental note to research recent queries about royal birth certificates. If this Thomas had been asking questions officially, there might be a paper trail. He also decided he needed to learn more about Camilla's activities in 1998, though he would have to be extremely careful about how he went about such research. The morning sun continued to stream through the palace windows, but, for James, the day had already taken on a much darker and more complex tone. He had been trusted with a secret that could shake the monarchy to its core, and now he had to figure out how to handle that responsibility wisely. One thing was certain: the quiet, peaceful days at his post were over. Whether he liked it or not, Captain James Morrison was now at the center of what could become the biggest royal scandal in decades. And it had all started with a 12-year-old girl's decision to trust him with what she had accidentally overheard in a rose garden on a beautiful autumn day. 3 days had passed since Charlotte's shocking revelation, and James Morrison found himself unable to sleep. Every night, he lay awake thinking about the implications of what the young princess had overheard. During the day, he maintained his professional composure, but, inside, his mind was constantly working through the possibilities and consequences. James had decided he needed more information before taking any action. He couldn't make a decision that could affect the entire royal family based solely on what a 12-year-old had overheard from a distance. He needed to verify some facts, and he needed to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. On Wednesday evening, James made an unusual request to his supervisor. He asked for access to the palace archives, claiming he was researching security protocols from the late 1990s for a routine review. It wasn't entirely a lie, though his real purpose was quite different. The palace archives were housed in the basement of Buckingham Palace, in a climate-controlled room that most staff never saw. James had been there only twice before in his 15 years of service, both times as part of official duties. Now, he found himself alone among rows of filing cabinets and document boxes, searching for any information that might shed light on Charlotte's story. He started with the official records from 1998. Palace schedules, travel logs, medical appointments, anything that might give him insight into Camilla's activities during that crucial year. What he found was interesting, but not immediately revealing. There was a notable gap in Camilla's public appearances between March and September of 1998. The official reason given was that she was dealing with a private family matter and had requested reduced public duties. At the time, this had been attributed to stress from her divorce proceedings and the ongoing media attention surrounding her relationship with Charles. But now, James wondered if there had been another reason entirely. He also discovered something else that made his pulse quicken. In the medical records section, there was a file that had been sealed by order of Camilla herself in late 1998. The file was marked Personal Medical Information Access Restricted by Royal Decree. James didn't have the authority to open it, but its existence was enough to make him think Charlotte might have stumbled onto something very real. As James was photographing some of the scheduled documents with his phone, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Quickly, he put everything back in its place and pretended to be reviewing security protocols from that era. The footsteps passed by without stopping, but the incident reminded him how dangerous his unofficial investigation could be. The next morning, James decided to take a different approach. He reached out to an old friend who worked for the General Register Office, the government agency responsible for birth, marriage, and death records in England and Wales. Inspector David Chen had served with James in the military before they both took civilian jobs. Over the years, they had maintained their friendship and occasionally helped each other with professional matters. "David," James said when he called, "I need a favor. It's sensitive, and I can't give you all the details, but it's important." David's voice was cautious when he replied. "What kind of favor, James? You know I can't just give out confidential information." "I understand," James said. "I'm not asking you to break any rules. I just need to know if there have been any recent inquiries about birth certificates from 1998. Specifically, requests that might have involved questions about parentage or requests for original documents that had been sealed." There was a long pause before David responded. "James, that's a very specific and unusual question. What's this about?" "I can't tell you everything right now," James said honestly. "But I believe there might be a security issue involving someone trying to establish false claims about royal connections. I need to know if there's any legitimate basis for concern." David sighed. "Give me a few hours. I'll see what I can find without crossing any lines. But, James, if this is what I think it might be, you need to be very careful. These kinds of inquiries can destroy careers." "I understand," James replied. "And, David, absolute discretion. No matter what you find or don't find." "Of course," David said before hanging up. While James waited for David's response, he tried to maintain his normal routine. But he found himself paying closer attention to Camilla whenever she was at the palace. He watched for signs of stress or unusual behavior. He noticed that she seemed to be making more private phone calls than usual, often stepping away from others to speak quietly into her mobile phone. On Thursday afternoon, James was stationed near the main entrance when he observed something that made his suspicions grow stronger. A man in his mid-50s arrived for a private meeting with Camilla. James recognized him as Robert Whitmore, a lawyer who specialized in family law and confidential matters. Whitmore was known for handling sensitive legal issues for wealthy and prominent families. The meeting lasted for over 2 hours, which was unusual for Camilla's typical appointments. When Whitmore left, James noticed that he was carrying a thick briefcase and looked deeply troubled. More importantly, James saw Camilla watching from a window as Whitmore's car pulled away. Her expression was one of deep worry and uncertainty. That evening, David Chen called James back with information that confirmed his worst fears. "James," David said, his voice tense, "I found something, and it's exactly what you were afraid of. There have been 3 separate inquiries in the past month about a birth certificate from August 1998. The requests came from a Thomas Ashworth, age 25, currently residing in St. Ives, Cornwall." James felt his stomach drop. Charlotte had been right about the name Thomas and the Cornwall location. "What kind of inquiries?" James asked. "He's been trying to obtain his original birth certificate," David explained. "The one he has appears to be incomplete or altered. He's specifically asking about the father's information, which was apparently left blank on the version he's been living with his whole life. James, this kind of inquiry usually means someone has discovered discrepancies in their official records. Is there anything else? James asked, though he dreaded the answer. He's hired a private investigator, David said. A reputable firm that specializes in genealogy and family history research. They've been making inquiries about births in private hospitals around London during the summer of 1998. James closed his eyes. The investigation was already underway from the other side. This Thomas Ashworth wasn't just curious about his parentage, he was actively seeking answers with professional help. David, I can't thank you enough for this information, James said. But, I need you to forget we ever had this conversation. Already forgotten, David replied. But, James, be careful. If this goes where I think it's going, there are going to be people who will do anything to keep it quiet. And, there are going to be other people who will do anything to make it public. You don't want to be caught in the middle of that kind of war. After hanging up, James sat in his small apartment, staring out at the London skyline. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and the picture they formed was terrifying in its implications. Thomas Ashworth was 25 years old, born in August 1998, living in Cornwall, and actively investigating his own parentage. The timing aligned perfectly with Camilla's unexplained absence from public duties. The location made sense for someone who wanted to raise a child away from media scrutiny. And, the fact that he was now asking questions suggested that something had triggered his curiosity about his true identity. James realized he had to make a decision soon. The investigation was happening whether the royal family was prepared for it or not. Thomas Ashworth and his private investigator were going to uncover the truth eventually. The only question was whether the family would be ready when that happened. The next morning, James made another disturbing discovery. He overheard a conversation between two palace staff members about increased security measures being discussed for all family members. When he inquired casually, he learned that there had been concerns about potential threats from individuals making false claims about royal connections. It was clear that someone in the family hierarchy was already aware of the Thomas Ashworth situation and was treating it as a security threat rather than a family matter. This suggested that there might be truth to the claims, and that the family was more concerned about damage control than about reuniting with a potential family member. That afternoon, James made a decision that would change everything. He requested a private meeting with Prince William, citing urgent security concerns that required immediate attention. It was a significant breach of protocol for someone at James's level to request a direct meeting with William, but he knew he could justify it based on his years of loyal service and the potential magnitude of the situation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, giving James the weekend to prepare for what would likely be the most important conversation of his career. He spent those 2 days carefully organizing his thoughts and deciding exactly how much he should reveal about Charlotte's role in discovering the information. Sunday evening, as James was reviewing his notes one final time, he received a phone call that changed everything. The caller identified himself as Thomas Ashworth. "Captain Morrison," the young man said, his voice nervous but determined, "I believe you work security for the royal family. I need to speak with you about a very sensitive matter." James felt his blood run cold. "How did you get this number?" he asked. "I hired a private investigator," Thomas explained. "He discovered that you've been making inquiries about birth certificates and royal family matters. I think we might be looking for answers to the same questions." James realized that his careful investigation had been noticed by the very person he was investigating. Thomas Ashworth's private investigator was clearly very good at his job. "Mr. Ashworth," James said carefully, "I think there might be some misunderstanding." "Please," Thomas said, and James could hear the desperation in his voice. "I'm not trying to cause trouble for anyone. I just want to know the truth about who I am. I've lived my whole life knowing that something was missing from my story. Recently, I discovered that my birth certificate has been altered. The information about my father was removed." James made a quick decision. If Thomas was going to find out the truth anyway, it might be better to have some control over how that happened. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, "this is a very complicated situation.
If you're willing to meet in person, I might be able to help you understand what you're dealing with.
But, you need to understand that this could have serious consequences for everyone involved.
I understand, Thomas said immediately. I just want the truth. I'm willing to meet whenever and wherever you think is best.
James arranged to meet Thomas the following Tuesday at a quiet pub in Greenwich, far enough from the palace to avoid unwanted attention.
He chose the date strategically, giving himself time to speak with Prince William first.
As he hung up the phone, James realized that the situation had moved far beyond anything he could control through careful investigation and planning.
Thomas Ashworth was not going to quietly disappear.
The private investigator was not going to stop digging. And, somewhere in the royal family, people were already making plans to handle what they saw as a crisis. James looked at his notes from the conversation with Charlotte that had started this whole chain of events. The 12-year-old princess had trusted him with a secret, and, now that secret was about to explode into public view whether anyone was ready for it or not. The only question now was whether James could help manage the explosion in a way that protected everyone involved, including the young man who just wanted to know the truth about his father, and the royal family who had apparently been hiding that truth for 25 years.
Monday morning couldn't come soon enough, and yet James dreaded it more than any day in his 15 years of royal service.
Monday morning arrived with an unseasonably cold rain that seemed to match James's dark mood. He had barely slept, running through different scenarios of how his meeting with Prince William might unfold.
Each possibility seemed to lead to disaster in some form or another.
James arrived at Kensington Palace earlier than usual, wanting to ensure everything was perfect before his scheduled meeting. He had requested 30 minutes with Prince William, citing urgent security concerns regarding potential threats to family privacy. It was vague enough to avoid immediate panic, but serious enough to guarantee attention.
At exactly 10 o'clock, James was escorted to Prince William's private office.
The room was smaller than many people might expect, but elegantly furnished with personal photographs and mementos from William's military service. William sat behind his desk, reviewing documents, and gestured for James to sit in the chair across from him. "Captain Morrison," William said, looking up with a friendly but businesslike expression.
"I understand you have some security concerns you need to discuss. What can you do for me?"
James had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but now that he was here, the words felt heavy in his mouth. He knew that once he spoke, there would be no taking back what he was about to reveal. "Your Highness," James began, 3 days ago, your daughter Charlotte came to me with some information she had accidentally overheard. I've since conducted some preliminary investigation, and I believe we may be facing a significant threat to family privacy and security."
William's expression immediately became more serious.
Any mention of his children and potential threats had his complete attention.
"What kind of information?" William asked. James took a deep breath.
Princess Charlotte overheard a conversation between the Duchess of Cornwall and an unidentified man in the palace rose garden. According to Princess Charlotte, the conversation involved discussion of a 25-year-old son named Thomas, along with mentions of documents that could prove everything about his parentage. The color drained from William's face. He sat back in his chair as if he had been physically struck. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've conducted some discreet inquiries," James continued. "There is indeed a Thomas Ashworth, age 25, living in Cornwall, who has been actively investigating his own birth certificate and parentage. He's hired a private investigator and has been making official inquiries about royal family connections." William stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the grey London sky. For several minutes, he said nothing, and James could practically see his mind working through the implications.
"Has my stepmother been informed that her conversation was overheard?" William asked finally.
"No, Your Highness," James replied. "I wanted to speak with you first to determine the appropriate course of action." William turned back to face James, and the expression on his face was one of deep concern mixed with what looked like resignation. "Captain Morrison," he said slowly, "what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room under any circumstances."
"Do you understand?"
"Of course, Your Highness." William returned to his seat and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together.
This Thomas Ashworth is not the first person to make claims about royal parentage.
Over the years, there have been dozens of individuals who have come forward with various theories about their connections to the family.
Most of them are mistaken or deliberately fraudulent. But James prompted, sensing there was more. But this case is different, William admitted.
My stepmother came to me 6 months ago with concerns about this particular individual. She was worried because his investigation seemed more thorough and professional than the usual conspiracy theorists we deal with. James felt his stomach clench.
What did she tell you about him? William stood up again and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of his office.
He removed a thick folder and returned to his desk. She told me that in 1998, she had been involved in helping a young woman who was in a very difficult situation, William said, opening the folder. This woman was pregnant, unmarried, and facing financial difficulties. My stepmother, through a private charity she supported, arranged for the woman to receive medical care and financial assistance.
And?
James asked, though he was beginning to understand where this story was leading. The woman gave birth to a son in August 1998, William continued. She was unable to care for the child, so arrangements were made for adoption. My stepmother personally oversaw the process to ensure the child would be placed with a good family.
James felt a sinking sensation. Your Highness, forgive me for asking, but was Prince Charles involved in this situation in any way? William's silence was answer enough.
After several long moments, William spoke again. The birth mother was someone my father had known briefly during a particularly difficult period in his relationship with my stepmother. It was not a serious relationship, but it did result in a pregnancy. The full magnitude of the situation was beginning to dawn on James.
Thomas Ashworth wasn't just claiming to be Camilla's son.
If William's account was accurate, he was Prince Charles's son. A 25-year-old half-brother to William and Harry that the public knew nothing about. The adoption was handled privately and confidentially, William continued. The birth certificate was sealed, and the boy was raised by a loving family in Cornwall who were told only that his birth parents were unable to care for him due to circumstances beyond their control. And now he's asking questions, James said.
Now he's asking questions, William confirmed.
And my stepmother is terrified that the truth will come out and destroy our family's reputation.
James tried to process the implications. Your Highness, what about the documents that Princess Charlotte mentioned? The ones that could prove everything? William hesitated before answering.
My stepmother kept detailed records of her charitable work during that period. She felt responsible for ensuring the child's well-being, so she documented everything.
The hospital records, the adoption papers, the financial arrangements.
She even arranged for periodic updates on the boy's welfare without his adoptive family knowing the true reason for her interest.
Are there DNA records? James asked.
There's a blood sample from the hospital, William admitted. It was supposedly destroyed, but my stepmother made sure it was preserved. She said she wanted to be able to provide medical information if the child ever needed it for health reasons. The scope of the potential scandal was staggering. Not only was there a secret royal son, but there was documented proof of his parentage that had been carefully preserved for 25 years. Your Highness, James said carefully, I need to tell you that the situation is more urgent than you might realize. Thomas Ashworth contacted me directly yesterday. He knows I've been making inquiries, and he wants to meet with me to discuss what he's discovered. William's face went white.
He contacted you directly? How is that possible?
His private investigator is apparently very skilled, James explained. They've been monitoring inquiries about royal family matters and birth certificates.
When I made my own inquiries, they noticed and tracked them back to me.
William stood up and began pacing behind his desk.
This is exactly what we were afraid of. Once these investigations become public, there's no controlling them. The media will turn this into a circus. What would you like me to do about my scheduled meeting with him? James asked.
William stopped pacing and looked directly at James.
I need you to meet with him.
But not alone, and not without preparation. I'm going to arrange for our family's legal counsel to be present, and I want you to have a recording device. We need to know exactly what he knows and what his intentions are.
And if his claims prove to be legitimate? James asked.
William sat down heavily in his chair. If his claims are legitimate, then he's my half-brother, and he deserves to know the truth about his parentage. But we also need to protect the institution of the monarchy and the privacy of our family.
This is going to require very careful handling. James nodded, understanding the delicate balance that would be required.
There's something else, William continued. I need to speak with my father and stepmother immediately. They need to know that their private conversation was overheard and that the situation is escalating rapidly. I also need to inform Catherine, and we'll need to decide how to handle this with Charlotte.
What should I tell Princess Charlotte? James asked.
She's been waiting for guidance on this matter.
William considered this carefully.
Tell her that she did the right thing by coming to you, and that we're handling the situation appropriately. But emphasize that she must not speak about this with anyone else, not even her brother or her friends.
This is a matter of family security now.
James agreed to convey this message to Charlotte. Captain Morrison, William said as their meeting was concluding, I want you to understand that your discretion and professionalism in this matter will not be forgotten. You've handled an extremely delicate situation with exactly the kind of judgment we value in our security personnel.
Thank you, Your Highness, James replied. What are the next steps?
I'll arrange for a family meeting this evening to discuss how we want to approach this situation, William said. In the meantime, proceed with your meeting with Thomas Ashworth as planned, but with the legal counsel I'll provide.
I'll have someone contact you later today with the details. As James left William's office, he felt both relief and apprehension.
Relief that he was no longer carrying the burden of this secret alone, but apprehension about what would happen next. The royal family was now officially aware of Thomas Ashworth's investigation, and they were preparing to respond. That afternoon, James received a call from Sarah Hamilton, one of the royal family's most trusted legal advisors. She arranged to meet with him before his scheduled meeting with Thomas Ashworth to brief him on how to handle the conversation. Captain Morrison, she said when they met, your role in this meeting is to gather information, not to provide it. We need to know what evidence Thomas Ashworth has, what his sources are, and what he's hoping to achieve.
Under no circumstances should you confirm or deny any details about royal family members. James understood.
He was being sent as an intelligence gatherer, not as a family representative.
What if he asks direct questions about his parentage? James asked.
You respond that you're not in a position to discuss such matters, but that his concerns have been noted and will be reviewed by appropriate authorities, Sarah replied. The key is to be respectful and professional while giving away no information that could be used against the family later. As Tuesday evening approached, James found himself preparing for what might be the most important meeting of his career. Everything that happened in the next few days would determine not only Thomas Ashworth's future, but potentially the future of the royal family's public image. The young man who just wanted to know the truth about his father was about to learn that his father was the future King of England. And the royal family was about to discover whether their 25-year-old secret could survive in the modern world of social media and investigative journalism. James checked his watch and headed toward Greenwich, knowing that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same for any of them. The pub in Greenwich was exactly the kind of place James had hoped for, quiet, dimly lit, and filled with locals who minded their own business. He arrived 15 minutes early and chose a corner table where he could observe the entrance while maintaining privacy for conversation. Sarah Hamilton had provided him with a small recording device disguised as a pen, and he had practiced using it until the motion felt natural. At exactly 7 o'clock, a young man entered the pub and looked around uncertainly.
James recognized him immediately, even though they had never met.
Thomas Ashworth had the unmistakable Windsor jawline and the same deep-set eyes as Prince Charles. The resemblance was so striking that James wondered how anyone who knew the royal family could fail to notice it. Thomas was tall and well-built, with dark hair that had a slight wave to it. He dressed casually but, well, in a way that suggested he had grown up with sufficient means but without ostentation. As he approached James's table, his expression was nervous but determined. "Captain Morrison?" he asked, extending his hand. "Mr. Ashworth," James replied, standing to shake hands.
"Thank you for coming. Please, sit down."
Thomas settled into the chair across from James and immediately leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I want to start by saying that I'm not looking to cause trouble for anyone," he said. "I just need to understand who I am." James studied the young man's face as he spoke. There was sincerity in his voice, but also a deep sadness that spoke of years of unanswered questions. "Why don't you tell me what you know, and what led you to contact me?" James suggested.
Thomas took a deep breath before beginning. "I was adopted as an infant by wonderful parents who live in Cornwall.
They've always been honest with me about the adoption, and they've always supported my desire to learn about my biological family. But every time I tried to get information about my birth parents, I hit walls."
"What kind of walls?" James asked.
"Official walls," Thomas replied.
"My birth certificate has clearly been altered.
The section for father's information is blank, but you can see marks where something was erased or covered up. When I requested my original birth certificate from the General Register Office, they told me it was sealed by court order and could only be opened under special circumstances."
James nodded, encouraging Thomas to continue.
"Last year, my adoptive mother became seriously ill," Thomas continued, and James could hear the emotion in his voice. "During her illness, she told me some things she had kept secret for 25 years. She said that the woman who arranged my adoption was someone very important, someone who had insisted on staying involved in my welfare throughout my childhood."
"What kind of involvement?" James asked.
"Anonymous gifts on my birthday and at Christmas," Thomas explained. "Payment for private school tuition.
Medical expenses when I needed surgery as a child."
My parents always thought it was part of the adoption arrangement, but my mother realized later that it was much more than that."
James felt a chill as he recognized the pattern.
It sounded exactly like the kind of long-term support that Camilla might have provided while staying in the background. "My mother also told me," Thomas continued, "that the woman who arranged the adoption had visited when I was about 6 months old. She said this woman spent hours just watching me sleep, and that she seemed deeply emotional about the whole situation. My mother always thought it was strange behavior for someone who was just facilitating an adoption."
"Did your mother describe this woman?" James asked, though he suspected he knew the answer.
"Older, elegant, well-educated. Someone who clearly came from money and privilege," Thomas said. "She drove an expensive car and spoke with what my mother described as a posh accent. Most importantly, she seemed to know things about my medical history that she shouldn't have known unless she had access to detailed records." The details were adding up in a way that made James increasingly convinced that Thomas's investigation was going to lead to the truth.
"What happened that made you decide to hire a private investigator?" James asked. Thomas's expression grew more intense.
6 months ago, I received a phone call from someone who claimed to have information about my birth father. The caller wouldn't give me a name, but they said I should look into royal family connections from 1998. James felt his pulse quicken.
"Did this caller provide any specific information?"
"They told me to research Prince Charles's activities during the summer of 1998, and they mentioned that there were sealed medical records at a private hospital in London that contained DNA information," Thomas said. "They also told me that someone had been making regular payments to ensure my welfare, and that these payments came from a trust fund connected to the royal family. This was information that went far beyond what Charlotte had overheard. Someone with inside knowledge had contacted Thomas and pointed him toward the truth."
"Mr. Ashworth," James said carefully, "that's a very serious allegation. Do you have any evidence to support it?"
Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "My private investigator has been very thorough," he said.
"We've traced the financial support I received throughout my childhood.
The payments came from a trust fund called the Cornwall Children's Welfare Trust. When we investigated this trust, we discovered that its primary benefactor is listed as C. Windsor."
James's blood ran cold.
C. Windsor could only refer to Camilla, and if there was a paper trail connecting her to Thomas's financial support, the case was becoming irrefutable. We also discovered, Thomas continued, opening his folder, that in 1998, Prince Charles made several private visits to the same hospital where I was born. The visits were listed in his official schedule as personal medical consultations, but the timing matches exactly with my birth date. Thomas handed James a photocopy of what appeared to be an official palace schedule from August 1998.
James could see the entries that Thomas was referring to, and the implications were unmistakable.
"There's more," Thomas said, his voice becoming more emotional.
"My private investigator managed to track down the nurse who attended my birth.
She's retired now, but she remembers the case clearly because it was so unusual. She said that a very important man visited the hospital immediately after my birth, and that he spent a long time looking at me through the nursery window."
"Did she identify this man?" James asked, though he dreaded the answer.
"She picked Prince Charles's photograph out of a lineup without hesitation," Thomas said quietly. "She also said that this man seemed deeply affected by seeing me, and that he had a long conversation with the woman who was overseeing my care." James realized that Thomas had built a compelling case that would be very difficult for the royal family to dispute. The combination of financial records, hospital visits, witness testimony, and physical resemblance created a picture that was convincing even to someone who wanted to find holes in it.
"Mr. Ashworth," James said, "assuming for a moment that your research is accurate, what do you hope to achieve? What would you want from the royal family?"
Thomas closed his folder and leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the conversation began, he looked uncertain.
"I don't want money," he said finally. "I don't want a title or recognition or anything like that. I just want to know the truth.
I want to know why my father never acknowledged me. I want to understand why I was given away when it seems like the people involved cared enough to ensure I was well taken care of."
The honesty in Thomas's voice was unmistakable.
This wasn't someone looking to exploit the royal family for personal gain. This was a young man who had grown up with a fundamental question about his identity and was finally in a position to get answers. "I also want to know," Thomas continued, "if I have siblings. If Prince Charles is my father, then I have 2 half-brothers who don't know I exist. I want to know if they would want to know me." James felt a deep sympathy for Thomas's situation. The young man was describing exactly the kind of family reunion that most people would consider heartwarming, but which could be devastating for the royal family's public image.
"Mr. Ashworth," James said, "I need to be honest with you.
The information you've shared with me tonight needs to be reviewed by people with much more authority than I have.
If your claims are legitimate, this is a situation that will require very careful handling by multiple parties." "I understand," Thomas said.
"But I also want you to understand that I'm not going to just disappear. I've spent 25 years not knowing who my father is, and I'm not going to give up now that I'm this close to the truth." James appreciated Thomas's directness. "What are your plans if you don't get the answers you're looking for through official channels?"
Thomas hesitated before answering.
"I hope it doesn't come to that, but my private investigator thinks we have enough evidence to interest certain journalists who specialize in royal family stories."
"I really don't want to go that route, but I will if I have to."
The threat was implicit but clear. If the royal family didn't engage with Thomas voluntarily, he was prepared to take his story to the media.
"I have one more question for you," James said.
"The person who called you 6 months ago with the initial information about royal connections, do you have any idea who that might have been?"
Thomas shook his head.
"It was a woman with an educated accent, but she wouldn't give any identifying information. She said she had worked for the royal family and that her conscience wouldn't let her keep the secret any longer." James filed this information away as potentially crucial. Someone inside the royal establishment had deliberately triggered Thomas's investigation. This wasn't a case of accidental discovery, someone had wanted the truth to come out. As their meeting was concluding, James made a decision that went beyond his instructions from Sarah Hamilton. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, "I'm going to speak honestly with you, even though I probably shouldn't. Your case is going to be taken very seriously by the appropriate authorities. I can't promise you specific outcomes, but I can promise you that your request for information will be reviewed thoroughly and fairly."
Thomas looked relieved for the first time all evening.
That's all I can ask for, he said. However, James continued, I need your word that you won't take any action with the media or any other public forums until you've given the family time to respond appropriately.
Can you commit to that? How much time? Thomas asked. James considered this carefully.
2 weeks, he said. Give us 2 weeks to review your information and provide you with a proper response.
Thomas extended his hand across the table.
2 weeks, he agreed. But, Captain Morrison, at the end of those 2 weeks, I'm going to get my answers one way or another. As James walked back to his car after the meeting, he realized that the royal family now had exactly 14 days to figure out how to handle the existence of Prince Charles's secret son. They could acknowledge Thomas and try to manage the public relations crisis that would follow, or they could deny his claims and risk having him go to the media with evidence that seemed increasingly difficult to dispute. Either way, the secret that had been kept for 25 years was about to change the royal family forever. And it had all started with a 12-year-old girl overhearing a private conversation in a rose garden. James looked up at the London sky and wondered if the monarchy was strong enough to survive having a secret prince revealed to the world. In 2 weeks, they would all find out.